Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope that y'all can hear. There was nothing to hear, so I saw some notes in the chat box, so I hope you can all hear. Appreciate you joining us in these unusual circumstances for our Educator Preparation Advisory Committee. We're looking forward to spending some time with you today. First off, I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. It takes a little bit of time to get those posted, but we are trying to record those and post those for future reference. So just wanted to give everybody a reminder of that. Additionally, a few just logistics. I think everyone is growing accustomed to living in the Zoom world. I think we have so many people on here, it might be a little unwieldy to go through and do introductions with everyone, but there are a lot of folks on here. So we just ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. Would encourage folks to use the chat functions for questions and comments. I know we're all kind of figuring out the limits of our connectivity with our internet connections. So just hoping you have a strong connection and working through this. So does anyone have any questions about those sort of logistics matters before we dive in? All right, thank you all. We are going to start with the issue that has dominated all of our time for the last month and a half or so, and that's the issues related to COVID-19. I think the bulk of the questions that you raised with us were related to the certification and testing issues. Those are absolutely the most pressing issues that we are facing as a group. We had been optimistic that we would have answers to many, if not most of those questions to share today, but we do not. We were really holding out hope we would have something more to share with you today, but we don't. Please know that we are aware of how pressing those issues are, and that just as you were in a hurry to have answers on that, we are as well. And so as soon as we have something finalized on that, we will share. And I think we're all continuing to work on this from our shared goal of ensuring we have the best prepared educator workforce possible to meet the needs of our students and districts across the state. So I just want to state that up front. I know that's not ideal that we don't have answers to those, but I'm very optimistic that we're going to have answers very soon to those most pressing certification and testing questions. So with that said, I'd go into a sort of a recap of some of the issues where we have provided answers. The March 26th communication with the governor's waivers related to the questions around clinical teaching, internship, the practicum experience, as well as the field experience requirements and principal and teacher surveys. So that first round of governor waivers covered those issues. I know there have been a few related issues that have come up since then that we haven't been able to address yet, but we're gonna work to get answers to that. The priority on the next round of communication is really going to be around these certification and testing issues. So I would encourage folks to continue utilizing the agency's COVID-19 webpage. There were some updates provided there around testing dates, extended deadlines, closure around test centers, those sorts of issues. So these issues, as they relate to ours, there's a whole lot of stuff being managed across the agency in collaboration with a number of other agencies across state government. So the staff and educator issues, and then so we have basically when we do have updated guidance, this will be simplified a little bit in that it will refer to guidance around in-service educators who are not part of a preparation program, and sort of combine and collapse some guidance there, and a separate stream of guidance for educators who are still in a program. So I think that's what the next round of guidance you should see, and so it should make this, it'll collapse some of these links here under staff and educator issues. The fingerprinting guidelines, that guidance that has come up as an issue, and so as of this time, about half of the fingerprinting centers in the state are still open, and there are no plans currently to waive the fingerprinting requirements. I see that we have a question in the chat from Zach, so let me see. Zach's asking, as it relates to testing and certification, who makes the decision regarding the issue? Is it SBEC, the commissioner, or staff? So I think, Zach, the way we've been trying to proceed on these issues is that where there are issues that SBEC rules permit SBEC to make the decision or permit staff to make the decision, we are operating and making those decisions quickly and providing that guidance. Where there are waivers of rule or state law, those have to go through a lot more steps in the process to get final answers. So the commissioner does not have authority to waive SBEC rule. I mean, the Pearson testing page is the best site to access updates on the testing center closure. That's being kind of kept up to date in real time. That's sort of the best source of that. We've been behind a little bit on updating our page. So these testing center closures as of now through April 30th, and that will be updated soon, I expect. I don't know exactly what the timeline is or what changes will be. This is kind of all evolving in real time, continues to evolve in that time frame. So I would encourage folks to stay connected there. So as far as outstanding issues, we recognize these are sort of the most pressing as it relates to certification options for 1920 finishers. The flexibility from the earlier round of waivers provided for the ability to finish with a shortened amount of clinical teaching or practicum or those sorts of things. The issues we're trying to work through related to certification and testing have to do with what will happen for these groups of candidates. So for those who have completed clinical teaching during the fall or spring, those who completed an internship during the spring, and those non-teacher candidates who completed a practicum during fall 2019 or spring 2020. So that's sort of the next round and highest priority level around that of the 19 and 20 finishers. In subsequent communication, we will try to address issues for the incoming 2021 interns. Know there have been questions about science teaching reading implementation, EdTPA pilot. These were all great questions that y'all submitted that are top of mind for us, and that we will hopefully be able to provide something on shortly after we get the questions related to certification options for the 1920 finishers. So I want to pause there and see, we've had a few things come up in chat, so I want to see what we've got there. Process for waivers. Okay, so we got a question about the process for getting waivers and a question around Pearson and online tests. And so I think what I would say on both of those things is more more guidance is coming. This falls into the bucket of things we don't have answers to, but we will have shortly, as soon as possible as we can get things out. I will say the process is different depending on where the authority is, and it sort of varies by issue. So I think we have a little more later to get into as it relates to sort of the questions that have come up from folks around COVID-19, but I want to pause here and see if there's anything else for that y'all would like to raise or ask in chat. I think we will come back to Zach, your question. I think we will come closer to addressing it later on, but if not, we will circle back. So now I want to move into the May SBEC agenda and sort of talk through the topics on this agenda. This is a shortened agenda, but it certainly won't seem like a shortened agenda once we get in through it, just because of the urgency around some of this rulemaking and some of the timelines for rulemaking. We had a lot that we wanted to kind of get on the radar with y'all and kind of share where things are headed. We shared the board book with you late Friday. Katie sent that to you, and so we will start with chapter 227, which is a proposal item. And I'll hand it over to Tam.
Hey, Ryan, if I could jump in first to do a little bit of framing before we get started.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. So before we dive into our individual items today, we wanted to pause to share with you all some adjustments that we're proposing to the board that have implications across a number of the items. So at the February SBEC meeting, staff discussed with the board bringing forward replacement certificate names for our certificate fields that are impacted by the House Bill 3 mandate for the Science of Teaching and Reading exams, specifically for all those educators who teach students in EC through grade 6. So we are going to be at the May meeting proposing replacement certificates for core subjects with, it'll be called core subjects with Science of Teaching Reading, early childhood through grade 6, core subjects with Science of Teaching Reading for 8, ELAR with Science of Teaching Reading for 8, and ELAR social studies, Science of Teaching Reading for 8. The intention here is to really recognize the additional training and demonstration of knowledge that those teacher candidates will have displayed by completing that STR exam requirement, and also to provide greater clarity for the field around transition timelines and the requirements for those candidates, for programs, and for the districts. So we're hoping that these replacement certificate names provide clarity and streamlined communication across the board. But in the implementation of these replacement certificates, Mark, if you can click to the next slide for me. There are, again, some ripple effects across a number of chapters. So the staff member who drives each one of these chapters will go into more detail, but at a high level in chapter 227, we'll be updating the PAC chart to include these replacement certificate names and their associated PACT exams. In 228, Tam will discuss how we're providing clarification on how to add these replacement certificates to the certificate offerings. For chapter 230, I'll be talking about how we are adding the replacement certificates and the required certification exams, including the STR exam, to the testing figure. In chapter 233, Marilyn will be discussing adding the replacement certificates to those categories of classroom teacher certificates. And then finally, I'll round it out with chapter 235, where we'll discuss how we're reorganizing our science of teaching reading standards so that they are applicable to all educators who teach students in EC through grade 6. We know that there are a number of moving parts here, so we will pause, just as Ryan did at the end of his section. We'll pause after we've discussed the changes in these chapters to answer any relevant questions related to the replacement certificates for our HB3 impacted fields. With that, I think I will turn it over to Tam then to discuss our first chapter, 227.
Actually, Jessica, this is Mark. I'm going to real quick talk about 227. I'm
Okay.
authorious. It's you know, what are you going to do? Thanks, everybody. Good morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about chapter 227, the proposal for item, that is item 7 in the SBEG agenda. As Jessica just kind of set us up, this item is necessary in order for us to add those new certificate names to the PACT chart. So we're specifying in there what pre-admission content tests go with those new certificate names, adding those new certificate names to the chart. We're also taking away, there was a 1-year expiration date related to PACT that was negatively impacting some candidates, and there's a little bit of additional technical cleanup in that proposal. So it's a pretty lightweight item for 227 for proposal, but necessary due to the new certificate names. Do anyone have any questions on that proposal? So thanks so much. With that, I will go ahead and move us into 228. And now I actually will turn it over to Tam. Tam, if you'd like to share about 228.
Hey, good morning. Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a great morning. What we'd like to do is show you, these are the areas that you've seen before, but what's in orange, we want to highlight this morning the 3 areas of change in revisions. So you can see number 1, number 4, and number 5. We're going to go into a little bit of detail on those. The others you have already seen in previous meetings. And so if we can do that, let's go ahead and Mark, advance to the next slide. The 3 changes for those 3 revision areas, let's talk about the first one. The first area brings chapter 228, as Jessica said, it brings into chapter 228 the replacement certificates for the House Bill 3 impacted certificates, and explains what the EPP must do to get approved for those 4 new areas. This is found on page 129. If you're following along in your board book, you'll be able to follow with me. 3 things that are highlighted here for you. Submitting a letter of attestation on or before December 1, saying the EPP will have curriculum modified by January 1st, 2021, the first day those certificates are operational. The second applies to new certifications only for the routes that have already been approved. So if you already currently offer those areas, by filing that attestation letter, you'll be able to add those new certificate areas in the current approved route or routes. And then finally, if the EPP does not file that letter of attestation by December 1, you can apply later using the process that's described in 228.10D under the subsection titled Addition of Certificates and Classes. So it kind of shows you how you can get into the new replacement certificate arena, by what date, and if you choose to go after that, then what you can do after that as well. Let's look at the second section. This pertains to adding curriculum requirements. So what we're doing here is, along with House Bill 18, we're adding that in rule that you must ensure that the curriculum for candidates for an initial teacher class will include the skills and competencies as prescribed in Chapter 235 Teacher Certification Standards. And we're asking that programs be able to ensure the curriculum for candidates for the principal class shall include the skills and competencies as prescribed in Chapter 241 Certification of Principals. This aligns the curriculum requirement for EPPs to ensure that programs are teaching the standards that SBEC approved. This revision allows the what we teach candidates in 228. It actually aligns, it actually lets us point back to rule in chapter 235, which contains the educator standards. And then if you look at the third change at the bottom of your screen, this does the same thing that the previous revision does. It simply adds that by ensuring that the 150 hours of clockwork and or training, coursework and or training for the initial teacher cert as prescribed in 22830D under the educator preparation curriculum that's provided to candidates prior to clinical teaching or internship, that this aligns to the board approved standards. So what we're simply doing is, as we continue to build out chapter 235, we're going to be making sure that 228 does in fact point back to the educator approved standards by the SBEC board. What we have taken out, just to highlight this, we've taken out the original figure in 228.10, and we've also taken out the discussed figure that we've discussed for the previous two meetings. We've taken those out. We feel like that the summer will be a little bit better time for us to go through the figure. If you're concerned about the components of the figure and where you can find those, they're over on the program provider resources page under the scoring rubric for 1920. If you're interested in kind of what's happening, it's not gone, it's just there. We're going to revisit it. It needs some, how we're going to approach that. We're going to work some on this summer when we're not in the middle of the things with adding the new certificates and such.
Okay, so now I'll take us into item 9, which is a chapter 230C proposal item. In this item, we are going to be proposing to the board updates to the testing figure that are based on that science teaching reading House Bill 3 requirement that we shared. So here we're going to be putting those replacement certificate names along with the associated certification exam requirements with their corresponding operational dates into the figure. So what you will see is that in the figure itself, we've included what I'm calling the original certificate names, and we've maintained in there the relevant aligned content pedagogy tests, but are now proposing the addition of replacement certificate names, again, that capture that science of teaching reading requirement, and have also implemented in the figure the associated content pedagogy tests. I haven't included the pedagogy columns in these representative charts because those remain the same across the original certificate to the replacement certificate. Specifically, you'll notice for the replacement certificates that we will be proposing the addition of 293, Science of Teaching Reading, Texas Interrule, and then you will notice for core subjects with Science Teaching Reading, EC6, and ELAR with Science of Teaching Reading 4.8, we are also proposing some content pedagogy exam transitions as well. Mark, if you'll transition to the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail. Specifically for our core subjects with Science of Teaching Reading EC6, our current content pedagogy exam, 291 core subjects EC6, is in the process of being updated to pull out some of that duplicative content that's now being assessed and measured in the Science of Teaching Reading exam. With those changes that are taking place to the exam, we will be implementing a new core subjects EC6, which will be exam number 391, beginning in 2020-2021. We recognize, though, that due to the nature of our core subjects exams with their distinct subtests, we are proposing to the board an overlapping implementation window in which candidates may complete either 291 or 391 during that 2021 kind of crossover phase-in period in order to achieve their core subjects with Science of Teaching Reading EC6 certificate. We're hoping that this leads to a more streamlined and transitional process. For our ELAR with Science of Teaching Reading 4 through 8 certificate, the current content pedagogy test is 117, the ELAR for 8 Texas. That assessment is also in the process of being updated due to the implementation of new ELAR TEKs. So again, it's our goal that our content pedagogy tests are always in alignment with our most up-to-date, our student standards as well. And so we are in the process of developing that assessment. And so the 117 ELAR will phase out at the end of 2021, and the 217 will begin at the beginning of 2022. So again, in that overlapping period, both will be applicable for our replacement ELAR with science teaching 4 through 8 certificate. The last area I wanted to emphasize, we shared with the board in proposing having the initial discussion about these replacement certificates at our February board meeting. We made sure to ensure with the board that there would be no additional requirements for programs in order to offer these replacement certificates on top of those that had already been articulated to programs. So there was a letter of attestation template that was shared with all programs in the December newsletter. And this letter of the purpose of this letter of attestation is for programs to attest to the update of their curriculum in alignment with the Science of Teaching reading standards. So as you can see here, the deadline is, as Tam already emphasized earlier, is that December 1st, 2020. If you have any questions about completing this letter of attestation, or if you need to access a copy, please feel free to contact your program specialists. And as Tam also discussed in 228, as we think about the alignment of curriculum to meet the needs of our science teaching reading standards, in those ongoing, those future continuing approval reviews will include a focus review on the science of teaching reading curriculum. I am going to pause here for 1 second because I do see that there was a question that came in related to the 291 versus 391 test framework. I wanted to share that we are in the process of posting to our TEA testing and standards page on the website that updated 391 framework. So folks will be able to do a cross-reference between those two frameworks. Again, primarily what we've done is look at the ELAR subtest and consider where there is duplicative content with the science teaching reading exam and extract that content in order to implement 391. But we will share, we had been holding off on some of our communication, but certainly following this, this meeting today, we will share out that updated framework that's posted to the website with the group.
Hey everybody, this is Mark. Dr. Capps, do you want to unmute and explain anything related to that? I would just like, I know that we were kind of looking at the chat, but I think it helps us if folks, if they do have questions about the specific issues when we pause for questions, if folks do take the opportunity to go ahead and unmute and ask those questions, just so that we don't have, so that we're able to identify those pieces. So Dr. Capps, did that hit what you were asking there?
Yeah, that Jessica, that really is what I was wondering about. Is once the STR is implemented, there's so much overlap with those sets of standards. I really was kind of wondering what would be taken out of the core. So do you know when that will be available on the website?
Thanks for asking that. Absolutely. So it actually is already posted to our website. We just had not begun the timeline of the 30-day public comment yet, in recognition of kind of everyone's current focus on addressing COVID-19 concerns. So again, we will share that framework out with everyone here immediately following the webinar today, but that we're intending to begin that 30-day public comment period in the near future. But it is
Thank you.
now for your review.
So good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you. I hope you and all of your families are doing well and continuing to be safe during this time. I've got the pleasure of hitting some highlights for item 10, chapter 233, our item on categories of classroom teaching certificates. So Jessica did a fantastic job of queuing this particular conversation up to verify that we are in this chapter officially adding the 4 replacement certificates to the list of certificates issued by the SBEC. This is largely being done to support the mandate from House Bill 3 that requires demonstration of proficiency in the science of teaching reading for all of those educators who are going to be teaching pre-kindergarten through grade 6. There's also a place in the rule text that certainly emphasizes that December 31, 2020 deadline that SBEC can issue certificates for the areas listed on the slide here. What we currently know right now is our core subjects exams for EC through 6 and 4 through 8, and then our English language arts and reading 4 through 8, and our ELAR social studies 4 through 8 exams. This table kind of gives you just a graphic reminder, similar to tables that Jessica presented in her other item for chapter 230, the current certificates that we know, and then effective January 1 of 2021, when that HB3 mandate becomes effective, the names of the new certificates that reflect that emphasis on science of teaching reading. One other thing that I would say to you all at your leisure when you're looking through the board book, the actual text for item 10 is 12 pages in length. I think it's helpful if you're looking for sort of the explanation and the reminders about the deadlines for issuance of the 4 certificates on the left-hand side of this particular screen. You can find the details in wording on pages 4 through 5 of the actual SBEC agenda item. And then if you want to see the rule text, that's reflected on pages 11 and 12 in the actual agenda item in that PDF of the board book that was sent to you. For now, I know we've got one additional item, so I'm going to hand it over to Jessica and know that our team will be back to talk to you and address any other additional questions you might have about the changes across these 5 rule chapters. Thanks so much.
Okay, and our last chapter that's impacted by our House Bill 3 mandate and our implementation of our replacement certificates is chapter 235, which is a proposal item. This proposal item does a number of things. First, related to our House Bill 3 mandate, we are proposing to the board a reorganization of our science of teaching reading standards. They are currently organized under our EC3 early childhood subcategory. So we're moving the standards from that subcategory to ensure that they're applicable for all educators who teach students in early childhood through grade 6. This is also our opportunity to propose to the board standards that have been developed by educator and stakeholder committees, including our bilingual Spanish standards, our special education standards EC through 6, and our special education standards, it actually should read 7 through 12, and our deaf-blind standards. So we're excited to have the opportunity to propose these standards that our educator stakeholder committees have worked so diligently on to the board for their review.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take care of item 12, which is a petition for rulemaking. Mark, if you could advance to the next slide, that'd be great. So at the February 21st SBEC meeting, Mr. Scott Sykes with ECAP submitted 4 petitions for rulemaking. In front of you is a summary of each one of those petitions. The first one is to change 227.58, the definition of content certification exam, to move it to the previous definition to allow it for certification purposes. Change 227.17 is to change the provision for formal admission to allow training prior to formal admission for candidates. The next 2 are regarding 229.4, were embedded into one petition, which is requesting to change the accountability provision to allow for EPP credit for any candidate who passes within the first 5 attempts. And then the last one is a change to 23036, which is requesting to extend the intern certificate to a 2-year certificate. Embedded in the actual item are all of the actual petitions themselves, where staff has provided background and impact of change. The recommendation is denial, since those petitions would reverse prior rulemaking that has happened within the last 4 years. The board has a choice between either denying the petition or directing staff to initiate rulemaking. And if the board does initiate rulemaking, then we will be bringing back proposed rule language. And that's it. I have a question here from Zach Rozelle for item 12 of stakeholder feedback sought or just staff review. So as required in statute and a board rule is that once petitions are submitted, we have 60 days to actually provide this to the board. We do not provide stakeholder feedback on petitions that are just being submitted. The board has not had any opportunity to weigh in on these. So if the board does direct staff to provide, to initiate rulemaking, stakeholder feedback will definitely be sought.
All right, thanks, Christy, for that. And then, so if folks do have questions, again, I think that, Christy, do you want to address anything else? Do you want folks to unmute maybe and explain what it is that they're thinking about? I just do worry about us getting, I don't want to misrepresent anybody presenting things in the chat, and I think it might be useful if folks do want to ask questions, go ahead. And when we kind of open the floor for questions, to go ahead and feel free to unmute and ask questions rather than just the text-based.
Sure. So okay. With that, Dr. Olson, I see where Matthew Capps has got a question. So if someone can unmute him and allow him to elaborate, that'd be great.
I bet he can unmute himself. I bet he's got it.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make sure I understand. Can you back up one slide?
Yeah, I got you.
I want to make sure I'm reading this right. So you are recommending a change to the accountability provision so that our accountability is based on the first 5 attempts, not the first 2?
Thank you for the question, Matthew. So what this is before you, this is a petition for rulemaking where Mr. Scott Fikes from ECAP has provided this as a recommendation to move from the 2-time test attempt to the 5 times. So again, this is just a petition that the board has not been able to weigh in on. This is just recommendation from an interested person to ask the board to initiate rulemaking to provide for that end result.
I will take what I can get. I appreciate the effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Capps.
So, hi, this is Joyce Alexander. I have one more clarification question. So did I hear you correctly say that of these 5 items that staff is recommending that SBAC vote against all of them?
Yeah, and who's asked this question? I'm sorry.
Joyce Alexander.
Yeah, so what we have recommended is based on rulemaking that the board has vetted within the last 4 years, that all of these rules would actually revert the SBAC action to previous rules. And so based on what the board has spoken to within the last 4 years, we have recommended that the board deny these petitions.
But we have talked, and forgive me if I'm stepping out of line here, about some of these things, maybe not the 5 attempts, but we've certainly talked about when admission happens and whether or not there's any training. And we've talked about the definition of the content certification exam and how as we move pedagogy in and out, it changes. So I guess I'm just confused why there's just a downright refusal on all these when some of them are actually similar to some of the things that we've talked about over the years.
Yeah, so that is a great point. And you know, one of the things once you get into the actual SBAC item, we've provided great detail of why we think that this rulemaking petition does not comport with the SBEC's current rules is that even though that you're right, there have been some who have spoken in favor of some of these petitions, this SBEC rulemaking action that is reflected in these 5 areas do include receiving stakeholder input, staff presenting discussion items. Where there was a proposed rule text, there was official public comment period, the SBEC approved the rule actions, and the SBOE also took no action. So because the process was vetted over a very long process and period of time for the board to get to where we are right now, it was not within staff's opinion and recommendation for the SBEC to initiate rulemaking to revert their current actions.
Well, thanks everybody for that one. Again, this is Mark. I'm gonna go ahead and chime in on item 14, which is the chapter 229 discussion. I think it's interesting because that last item was about sort of like, do we engage it in sort of like emergency rulemaking, or do we go forth about, doing our kind of standard procedure where we do issues come up in the field, we work through them kind of through the committees and channels that we have with our stakeholders, and we get together a rule item that reflects a lot of different stakeholder input and a lot of processes and allows us to really feel like we're presenting something solid that's been vetted from a lot of different angles to the SBEC. And that's why I'm excited about what it is that we'll be discussing in chapter 229, because the items that are coming up in chapter 229 discussion are things that have been worked out with this group, things that have been worked out with the data working group, things that have been developed in conjunction with an ad hoc group. So stuff that has really moved along kind of via those standard processes where we do get to engage with stakeholders. So looking at this, there's 3 big pieces that we knew and had anticipated being part of chapter 229 for discussion, and then a new one. As we had, I believe, discussed at least with the, definitely with the working groups, we worked through a bunch of stuff with them, but also I think stuff that's come before this group before is looking at ACEP indicator number 3, looking at the ACEP index, which updates the way that we determine accreditation statuses annually based on ACEP data, and then updating the ACEP manual to reflect the changes made to the ACEP indicator 3 and the ACEP index. Also, interestingly enough, we've inserted language that we'll be talking about with y'all related to accreditation statuses related to an emergency declaration. So we're going to talk through the as planned items first, and then we will look closely at the accreditation status related to the emergency declaration. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Nicole Foots. Nicole, you can go ahead and unmute and talk us through a little bit about indicator 3.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So as you're probably aware, indicator 3 has had statutory guidance surrounding it for many years. It was a part of TEC and TAC and TAC 229.4A3. And essentially it is the connecting of educator preparation programs, accreditation statuses to the extent practicable to improvements in student achievement of students taught by beginning teachers. So we're looking to see how we can connect student achievement, student growth to educator prep programs. And so the process for standing this up over the last literally decade has been, there have been numerous attempts and there have been numerous kind of pauses and progress made. So in order for my application or trying to stand this up, I first kind of researched the prior attempts and tried to understand what had gone well and what were some of the shortcomings. Using that understanding, we created an indicator 3 work group with a variety of stakeholders, and we created a model. So our model seeks to use data that we already have, use the data infrastructure that we already have available that's kind of recently stood up in order to answer this question. So once we created the model using statewide accountability data system the accountability system data that we have. We ran a pilot of about 17 EPPs to make sure that the numbers could actually be connected. We found that they were able to be connected, and so then we analyzed that data set to ask a plethora of kind of research questions, because we wanted to make sure that they weren't predictive in a negative way, there weren't any type of biases apparent in the model. And we wanted to troubleshoot some of the stakeholder concerns that we felt were like very valid, and some of the issues that had come up in the prior attempts. Once we were able to kind of walk through those research questions, which we did over kind of the entirety of last summer, working with the work group, having kind of conversations around it, having the work group give prompts and give their feedback on what these questions mean, and what some of the results meant, giving us that lens. We were able to then run a full data set for the year 17, 18, and 18 and 19 using the accountability system data, and then we were able to finalize a method and make a recommendation for a standard. So with that, so our final model is going to use STAR student growth progress measures, which is domain 2A. Essentially that tracks, if you can see in this diagram, so that tracks a student's proficiency level at the beginning of the school year or the end of the previous school year. And then it notes their proficiency level at the end of that school year. And we can attribute that growth or that change, that delta, to the beginning teacher that was teaching them. And so within the statewide accountability system, that is the student growth domain. And they are giving one of 3 scores. So if the student proficiency is lower than anticipated or lower than the previous year, then that student gets a score of 0. There are no negative scores. If the student met expected proficiency levels, then that student gets a 0.5 score. And if they exceed proficiency levels or expectations, they get a score of 1. So with that kind of mindset, we're assuming that a 0.5 is about a neutral stance, that the student began and ended at the exact same proficiency level. And that comes into play in our model as we think of that being the proficiency standard that we'd like to ascribe to. So using this information and creating the model, we collaborated with EPPs and our work group and researchers to answer questions about the data. We looked at everything from like a campus fixed effect. We looked at differences between cohorts, like year 1 teachers, year 2, year 3, if there were differences, as we could expect. We looked at like racial demographics and gender demographics and how that plays into the model, since for the purposes of ACEP, all this data are disaggregated by race and gender. And we were able to, the good news is like none of this was predictive in negative ways. So with that, and we have a plethora of information, I can answer any questions about that as well. But essentially, so we're generating a growth score by collecting the information at the student level for beginning teachers. And then we create a cut score, which we were using the neutral point, which is 0.5, to determine if the teacher met the standard or not. And similar to the way we do with indicator 2 and 5, we roll that up to the EPP to see what percentage of the teachers for that EPP met our standard. So that is the current indicator 3 standard. Mark, let me know if I'm missing any key points, and I'm also available to answer any questions.
Yep, Nicole, thanks for that. I'm just going to chime in on a couple of things. One, as Nicole noted, we've gotten to, she's gotten to lead this work over the past year and a half, working really closely with that work group, and that's exciting. Second thing I would plug, I know that we sent out the PDF of the agenda. There is an attachment that is a report about this work that addresses likely many of the questions that you may have about it. And so please do, if you read that report and still have sort of like unresolved questions, or if you also, we've put into the manual sort of the nuts and bolts about how we go about getting these numbers. If you review those and still have questions, we're more than happy to talk about them. And again, we are at just the discussion phase of this item. And so we do have the opportunity moving forward to, you know, if we've got to add more language, add more explanation, that there's our opportunity to do that. So that's the piece about indicator 3, which we knew was one of the things that we knew that was coming. The second piece that I think we've discussed quite a bit with this group about is the shifting from, to an ASEP index. So this combines all of the different ASEP indicators into an overall system. Now we've talked about that this can provide flexibility to EPPs and provide better transparency to the field, because instead of a single cell model, it gets us to putting all of these different indicators together. We've worked over the course of the year, again, very closely with the data working group on this, and also with this group here, where we talked about not only can we bring all of these pieces together, but that provides us the opportunity to weight the indicators differently. And some of the discussions and modeling that we've done in the data working group. Now we also sort of like understanding that this is going to be a change. We looked at how can we make this change kind of straightforward and transparent. We don't want to, shift gears mid-game on folks. And so the way that we've inserted this into the rule text for discussion here is so that in the 2020-2021 reporting year, EPPs would get the better result of either the current system or the new index system. So we think that that should help with the transition questions to this new ASEP index. So looking a little bit at the results and what the model is that we're proposing for the May meeting, as we discussed, there's a number of different weights. We're able to weight the different indicators differently. And the weights that you see here are whole number weights. The bigger the number, the bigger the weight. These are, again, we discussed and worked with the data working group around this. So we see these are the weights for the indicators on the left, and then the weighting for the demographic groups on the right. This is an idea, again, that came out of the data working group, that essentially the all category counts the same as all of the demographic groups summed up together. And so that allows us to bring all this stuff together. And if you're doing it, if there is an individual demographic group where perhaps an EPP misses a standard, it does not count as much towards the final score if the standard was met for the overall group. The overall group is here pretty clearly more powerful with the weighting. We would set cut scores related to this. Again, I got to discuss this, that this allows us to put kind of everything onto a percentage range. And we looked at probation at 80 and warned at 85. What that looks like data-wise using last year's data, this is a distribution of what those scores would look like. And also then includes the relation to the old system, which is what you see in the bottom right. So when we put all of these ed prep programs together and we use the index, the dots that are on the left that are shaded in red are the dots that are 80% or below. That would be under this discussed rule text, would be as probation. The yellow are between 80 and 85, and the green are 85 and above. Modeling this way, it keeps it would have about the same count on probation, but far fewer programs on warned when compared to the old way of doing the standard. So I can pause there and see if folks had additional questions or clarification that I can provide related to the index. Again, if folks wanted to unmute and share, if they wanted to raise anything here, totally happy to raise anything at this discussion stage.
Hey, Mark, this is Zach Roselle.
Go ahead, Zach.
I just put a comment in. It seems to me that indicator 4, since the EPP has direct control over that it would receive a higher weight. And then, if it's at a 3 now, take it to a 4, and then take the non-PPR down, since there's less control that the EPP has over that. But like, I agree with the PPR being a 4. I just think when the EPP has control over it, give that rating a higher weight than that seems to make sense in my mind. And I didn't know if the data work group had different thoughts on that, but that would certainly be my recommendation.
Yeah, Zach, so I can share a little bit about, this is, the data working group worked through modeling this stuff in 2 different meetings that we had, and I, collected feedback and summarized it, and these are the numbers that we landed at. And so, that's what we brought forth here. And so, I think that there were people who wanted stuff higher, people who wanted stuff lower, as you might imagine, in a diverse group of folks. But that's where kind of these numbers are coming out of. I think that at this point in the process, that one of the nice parts about having a discussion item with the SBEC is that, of course, if board members have, similar feelings or feelings and feedback around these weights, it provides us the opportunity to step back and make adjustments prior to your proposal. So I feel like we're in a, we've engaged in a process so far, and since we're a discussion phase right now, we're still able to engage in that process. Did folks have additional comments?
This is Matthew. I agree with Zach, but Mark, I was on that data advisory group too. And it's the same thing I've said for years. I really don't, this don't bother me to be held accountable for things I have control over. As I said in my comments, we're seeing a lot more students coming to us from 2-year colleges, which means that they're bringing in coursework from high school that they have credit for. So we have no control over that. So yeah, that's why I would like to see a lowered rating on that. Even if we had to raise the rating on something else, like a principal's survey, I would be even okay with that. Or go to the 5 times passing. If a student can take it 5 times and I'm going to be held that accountable on it, then let me have 5 times to be held accountable. It just feels like that we're being boxed in from 2 different sides or 3 different sides in terms of where the coursework's coming from, how we're held accountable on it, and how that varies from what the students are actually, that our candidates are actually going through in terms of their opportunities to retest that. If it's okay for them to take a test 5 times, why is it not okay for us to be held accountable on that? Especially if we're going to have that level of an accountability rating.
No, thank you for that. And again, just to clarify on this, the index is not, the goal of the index isn't to change the performance standards. It's only changing how the standards come together. And so when we're looking at this piece, that is really what that's about. But I think thank you for that input. And also just to clarify, the data working group did play with a lot of different numbers, but then I did gather kind of each individual's final information and final recommendation and gathered them together. Just want to be clear about that process.
Hi, this is Joyce Alexander again. Can you give me just a snippet of information on the STAR growth progress measure? So are we comparing it versus a 2% growth, or is it a basic standard of information that must be met each year?
Yeah, it's a great question. So individual students, and Nicole, you're gonna have to tell me if I'm wrong, but individual students get a proficiency level, right? So that can be either, does not meet, approaches, meets, and I'm gonna have to scroll back to the thing, meets or mastered, did not meet, approaches, meets, or masters. So they have that score in year 1. And then in year 2, they have they test and then they have a proficiency level in year 2. And what the K-12 accountability system does is that it compares those scores and then assigns a growth score at the individual student level. And that individual growth score is a 1, a 0.5, or a 0, as you see at the top there. So this is all based on what's already built into the STAR and what's already built in to the K-12 accountability model is what proficiency level the student starts at and what proficiency level the student ends at. And so all we're doing is we're taking the students in the teacher's classroom and we are essentially finding the average growth score within that classroom. and then comparing that to a standard of 0.5, which we see as being the neutral, right? The straight across, if you go approaches to approaches, that's where that's at. And then seeing how many of the beginning teachers meet that sort of like do no harm standard.
That helps, Mark. Let me add one comment on the other discussion about sort of being boxed in on all three sides. You know, what we have had to do is to totally rethink our responsibility for the content area test. So we're having the same issues, people taking high school, you know, world history or American history, and then coming 4 years later and shockingly not remembering all the details. I mean, who knew? So we have actually, we're working to design a test to give our students that they have to pass before we even let them take the test in the social studies area in particular, because that's the part we're just super struggling with. And so they have to not only take the test, but they'll have to do remediation and retake the test before we even let them do it, because some of that stuff is just so old, they can't remember any of it. So we've had to change the way we think about everything in terms of social studies. The rest of it for us is not a big issue, but social studies continues to be a challenge for us.
Thank you for sharing that.
We've done the same thing. We have a course for EC6 4 through 8 that they have to take in social studies. And now we reached the point that they have to have a B in that course for that course to be able to count towards our recommendation for certification. And it's going to slow down the number of teachers that we produce. The only reason one of the reasons we're doing that is because we're trying to deal with the issue of the level of accountability. The other thing I want to say about the data advisory group is the people in that room, and I know that they know what they're doing. They really understand data. Mark, they're not the ones being held accountable for all this. All the deans are the ones being held accountable for that. So they may not see that a 3 on non-PPR isn't a big deal as opposed to a 2 or a 1. But I'll promise you, all the deans sitting in this room, all the deans in TACTI, that is a big deal to them, because it's exactly what Joyce is talking about. We're having to figure out ways to slow down the number of students who actually we get held accountable on. And we are all only doing that, one, because of where the students are coming from with those courses, how long ago those were, and how we're being held accountable for it. That's what we're doing in response to that rule. That doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I appreciate you surfacing that. And I think that, of course, we've got continued kind of iteration work. To us, it made sense to start with the data working group around finding recommendations related to this modeling piece. But I think it makes sense, you know, and that's why we're here at the discussion phase, gathering feedback from y'all. And I would note, you know, that some of the things around, one of the things that we think is a benefit to the index system and going towards an index is that it does allow, whereas previously we were in a single cell model, right? And if you missed one demographic group, if you missed for one indicator, or for 2 indicators or 2 individual demographic groups, that knocked you down to warned or probation. What we're bringing forth for discussion, the aspect with the item here is that and you know, we've modeled this out and taken a look at this. Programs can, in a year, miss a standard for miss a standard for a demographic group or for multiple demographic groups, or even can miss at the all level and still be, you know, above that level and still be accredited. And so one of the benefits of an index system is it allows for some of that flexibility into the system, whereas previously we didn't have any. So I'd like to, if it's okay, I'd like to go to the next piece that I wanted to make sure to call y'all's attention to in 229 here. And what that is the discussion of the accreditation statuses for 1920. So again, I think in the when we first had an EPP town hall related to some governor's waivers, we said we think that SBEC can deal with EPP accreditation, and this is what we're bringing to the SBEC for discussion related to that. And so we know we're trying to limit the impact of test center closures, of district and charter closures, and of course, those survey waivers on EPP accountability. And so what we're recommending is that a blanket designation of not rated declared state of disaster for educator preparation programs based on 1920 data. This follows the approach in the K-12 system, and we think that it provides, again, we know that folks weren't able to do their last observation and that got waived, but how does that work but how does that work for accountability? What we're saying here is that everybody's gonna get the declared state of disaster not rated status. How would we do indicator 2 if we aren't giving the surveys? How would we do indicator 5 if we aren't doing the surveys? Again, we're looking at all of these issues, and this is what we're bringing to the SBEC for discussion related to these statuses. To note, we also brought language saying that the data related to the indicators would be, reported to EPPs. I think it is there's likely utility for programs to still have that data reported to y'all. But for the purposes of accountability, we wouldn't be using it in this year. So that's that's what we're going to bring for discussion to the SBEC related to the accountability and accreditation for this year. Do folks have questions or discussion points about that?
Hi, this is Patrice Warner, Texas State. I think that's a good solution. It covers a lot of issues and things that we've been concerned about. So thank you. And this is one of those things that seems like that is under your control and a decision that you could make. So I appreciate you making it.
Hi, this is Rebecca at Lamar University. Unfortunately, right now we are on accredited probation. So after this period of not rated, how does that work when we go back into normal reporting?
So that's a great question. So the way this is set up is that for 1920, based on 1920 data, this will be the status. But data will then start to be generated again in 2020, 2021. And so then we would, again, follow the administrative code and provide accountability ratings based on the 2020, 2021 data. So thinking about, that would take us moving forward past that into the future on that. We won't be, one of the things that we do call out, hold on, I'm trying to find it in the, and to note that also up for discussion here is that in that 2020, 2021 academic year or reporting year, we would use the better of the result from the index system versus the old system. So that would provide additional flexibility for programs in that 2020, 2021 reporting year. The draft rule language that we have also says that this would not add additional years to any count of years prescribed here. So you wouldn't, so say I was warned year 1, I'm not going to come out of this and be warned year 2 just because another year went by, right? I would still be warned year 1 coming out of that. So we aren't using this towards counting kind of those years.
Thank you, Mark. That would you go back and say, well, I guess if the accountability rating in the 2021, would you use this the last year before the not rated as part of the decision-making for the accreditation status?
Yes, so this does not, so just like it's not counted as a year, it's also not counted as interrupting counted years.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and again, that's following what they're doing on the K-12 side. And we do have, Dr. Queen, did you want to raise that? I'm trying to get people's voices because I really like it when I get to hear people's voices because I'm in my house by myself all day.
Good morning. My question is, when will we put the student achievement measure in play as part of that accountability measure?
Yep. So thank you so much for asking that question. So what we did currently, and again, we're at the discussion phase for this, but what we wrote in currently is that 1920 and 2020-2021 would be report only and would be non-consequential for those years. But it will allow us to get the data that's available out to programs. So that's the draft rule language right now. Any other questions related to the accreditation statuses? I think that's all for me on 229. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark. So I am going to round out our agenda items today with item 15, which is a discussion of our STR transition and our standard test development update. So in item 15, we're going to be following up with our discussion with the board in February by providing an update on our science of teaching reading communication up to this date and plans for ongoing communication going forward. In addition, we're going to provide our standard update on our test development timelines and those transition periods to the board as well for their review. Specifically as it relates to our communication plan related to the science of teaching reading and the science of teaching reading transition going forward, we identified two broad categories that we want to continue to build our communication plans around. And these are categories that we would really appreciate your feedback and input in relation to. I think probably our first and most pressing communication category and that we're focused on building a communication plan or reinforcing our communication plan going forward is around our science of teaching reading implementation requirements and the associated timelines. We have been in consistent communication with the board, with you all as our colleagues in the EPAC, as well as some of our professional organizations around the science of teaching reading requirements and timelines, but plan to continue to engage in those communication channels, as well as start to activate some additional channels as we go into this period before full-scale implementation of January of 2021. So I'll be sharing with the board some pathways and some methods that we plan to communicate to not only you all as our partners and preparation programs, but also communication specifically to candidates, as well as our LEAs across the state, so that everyone has a clear understanding of the requirements and the timelines. Specifically, some methods that we're thinking about is direct and ongoing email communication. We're planning on establishing some informational webinar series that would both be targeted towards preparation programs as well as candidates or LEAs, so everyone's clear around requirements and timelines, as well as consistent updates to our standards and testing website. Mark, if you wouldn't mind transitioning to the next slide. I've just pulled two of the slides that we discussed at our last EPAC meeting, just to kind of reinforce some of the key messages that we will be reinforcing as we share the communication to the field. The first, what we wanted to revisit are the requirements by field experience pathway for the 2020-2021 academic year. So for candidates who have not completed all program requirements, all certification exam requirements, and have been issued a certificate prior to January 1, 2021, they will be required to take the Science of Teaching Reading examination in order to be issued a standard certificate. And so what we've captured here, what the implementation of those certification exams may look like for our traditional and our alternative certification pathways for this 2020-2021 academic year for candidates who are seeking standard certification at the end of the next academic year. Mark, if you switch to the next slide, thanks. For all candidate cohorts who begin after that 1/1/2021 timeline, for our traditional candidates, they would be required to complete student teaching, their content pedagogy test, that STR exam, and their PPR or EdTPA prior to standard certification. And for all our alternative certification candidates, they would be required to take that content pedagogy exam and the STR examination prior to being issued their intern certification. And then again, similar to traditional pathways, complete that PPR or EdTPA in order to be issued standard certification. The second communication category that we wanted to highlight for the board and also elicit some feedback from you all around are specifically around the STR exam specifications and curriculum alignment. We know that we've engaged in a pretty extensive conversation with members of the EPAC and our broader EPP community around resources and supports to support that curriculum alignment given our new Science of Teaching Reading standards. We were incredibly excited to be able to offer letters training throughout this past academic year for all interested programs, and we got some really great feedback from the field around that training. So that training series has now come to an end. And again, the intention there was to provide some background content and context that specifically aligned with our Science of Teaching Reading standards. We know in our previous EPAC meeting, we had a great conversation around alignment between our Reading Academy's content and our Science of Teaching Reading standards. And we wanted to share that we've been in ongoing communication and collaboration with our colleagues internally who lead the Reading Academy's work. And we are in the process of coordinating some pathways for you all, our EPP partners, to be able to gain access to that Reading Academy content. So again, more information on that to come, but we're excited to kind of continue to see that deep alignment and collaboration there between our Science Teaching Reading standards and examination and the Reading Academy content. In addition, we plan to, over the course of the summer and fall, begin to design and facilitate webinar series specifically focused on that curriculum alignment and do some unpacking of some of our exam specifications as well as we begin to wrap up the design and finalize our preparation manual and look forward to being able to share some of those exam questions with the field so that you all can begin to kind of further align curriculum with that expectation for rigor. And then lastly, it's our intention to kind of continue to provide those timely updates to the board, to this committee, and to other professional organizations. Mark, if you want to go to the next slide, your feedback is greatly appreciated. And I see some questions that are coming in the chat, so I want to be able to offer space for folks to highlight their questions in a second, but also wanted to name that if there are any other additional Science of Teaching Reading communication topics or methods of communication that we might not have considered up until this point, we really would appreciate your feedback as well. Dr. Capps, I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit more. Well, actually, I'll open the floor if there's any other questions, clarifications. I know that I've received questions from Dr. Capps and Dr. Gavan. I don't know if they wanted to share as well.
My concern is the compressed time between January, when we got a set of standards that we don't actually have any kind of sample assessment for in regard to the STR, I know that there's a lot of training with that, but we have students who right now are in the semester right before clinical teaching in the fall. Once they get into clinical teaching in the fall, we really don't like them doing anything else but focusing on clinical teaching. So now we're getting compressed on one end where we've not really had access to anything more than just a set of standards, and there's no time to be able to teach them about the science of teaching reading. I think that if the webinar series, if that's well done and they have open access to that and it aligns well, that may help resolve that issue. And I'm really concerned about how hard we're pushing this timeline with January 1, 2021 to be able to get somebody who's essentially at the end of their program to be ready to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Kapp. So we appreciate that feedback, and know that we are on a compressed timeline here. We do recognize that, knowing that we have this statutory mandate that we need to adhere to with that 1/1/21 timeline. The intention of this item and kind of sharing these initial plans for ongoing communication is to begin to get additional information, additional context, additional supports out to the field as soon as possible, to provide with the intention of providing additional context around those science of teaching reading standards. I think the letters training hopefully did a lot to kind of set the stage for that background context, that kind of foundation of science of teaching reading that the standards deeply aligns with. But again, it's our intention to begin to develop out those webinar series and share those with the field in short order, that help to bring additional clarity to what the science of teaching reading exam looks and sounds like in implementation, because we know that that helps inform the development and the implementation of curriculum. So we definitely hear that feedback and are working to ensure that we're getting that information out.
Good morning, this is Veronica. A question for you. The letters training was extremely beneficial. It was a great deal of information, but having the books provided a support system once we got home and were able to process that. Having access to reading academies would be really beneficial, especially for our students. My question would be, would we have to pay a fee, because schools are required to pay a fee? The other one is there going to be a pilot for STR? I would imagine, other than a written response, the multiple choice is going to be, I'm not saying the exact content, but the format and the framework is going to be similar to what is on the ELAR portion of the course subjects. Asked a lot of questions, so.
Thank you so much. So in relation to the EPPs gaining access to the Reading Academy content, we are in kind of coordination with our team internally, and we will share out additional information and next steps once we have that codified. I just didn't want y'all to think that we had kind of let that thread completely go. We are having this ongoing communication to ensure that you all do gain access. And so we're certainly taking into consideration things like potential fees that may be required as we're beginning to develop that coordination. In terms of the content and rigor of the science of teaching reading exam itself, I would say that there is really strong alignment between what you see in the standards and the test framework to the rigor and relevance of the exam items themselves. So as we have an opportunity to share sample exam items with the field, we are looking forward to do that to help kind of support curriculum alignment going forward.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions or comments?
Hi, this is Patrice Warner again. I just wanted to bring up the budget issues that we have since we started talking about fees for things that I'm sure all of our institutions are in the same boat, where we've had budget freezes, we've had 50% of operating budget frozen into a savings account, quote unquote. These are just very, very tough financial times for institutions and individuals, of course, that's not even to consider the financial struggles that our candidates are going through right now. So I just wanted to raise that in terms of when we're talking about fees for things. And I know that y'all are aware of that, but I felt I needed to say it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Werner. We certainly are taking that into consideration. Any other comments or questions related to the science teaching reading transition?
This is Patrice again. I just want to reiterate one more thing about getting sample test questions sooner rather than later. It's of paramount importance, because how a question is asked has everything to do with how we approach curriculum and how we're preparing people to take the test. So having the set of standards, that's one thing, and we're grateful for that. But until we understand the test itself, we're not prepared to prepare our candidates for this test. And I get the statutory requirement that's pretty unmovable, but
Dr. Werner, thank you for that comment as well. We certainly understand that having access to those exam questions really supports programs and understanding the rigor and alignment that's required for kind of mastery on the exam. And so that's certainly something that we're taking into consideration, and is certainly will be a part of our ongoing communication plan with the field. All right, turn it back over.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and thanks everyone for walking through this. Just really quickly sharing out our upcoming SBEC rulemaking schedule. This is the plan as it is now, so you can kind of see where all these proposal items, as well as the discussion item, fit within our May meeting, just so you kind of know what's proposal versus discussion, and then moving into our meeting after that, just so you sort of see a sense of the timeline when things were on. This is all subject to change. The world is a very, very different place, but this is the current plan that represents our best thinking on where this SBEC rulemaking timeline is. And so we've sent you this deck, so you have that kind of as a reference on these slides, but wanted to make sure we provided that back to you. That was a request a while back from this group, and we want to make sure we're kind of keeping that on the radar. Any questions there along that timeline? All right, we will move into sort of the requested items that have come up through the discussion here, or that y'all submitted. So as I mentioned earlier, what is being done for candidates who've not been able to complete all testing requirements. So here you'll see variations on these questions, but they essentially center around this sort of overarching question around whether it's a candidate in clinical teaching, a candidate on an internship, sort of what's going to be done with there. And as I indicated earlier, I expect that these are the questions that will be addressed in the next round of guidance we're able to provide related to COVID-19 and its impact on candidates and preparation programs. After that round where we address the certification and testing questions, we expect we're going to, we've had several questions around science teaching, reading, timeline, that sort of thing. So as it stands, there is no flexibility in that timeline deadline for science teaching reading. We will, we're monitoring closely, and we don't, we can't change the law. But we are monitoring the situation closely, aware of the constraints y'all are under, aware of the compressed deadline, aware of the implications on test development. And so this is sort of toward the forefront of other things we're going to continue to be looking at and thinking through. Jessica, I don't know if you want to add anything here.
No, Ryan, I think you covered it. Certainly anticipate we'll continue to have conversations related to our science teaching reading timelines going forward.
Similarly, y'all asked some questions, several good questions about the impact on the EdTPA pilot. I think this is a lot of, we don't know right now, but we know that there will need to be discussions. So one of the things that was originally intended to be on this SVEC agenda related to alternative pilots and those sorts of things. So at the direction of Chairman Cavazos, that discussion was slid back to the July board meeting. So we should know some more in July about some of these timeline things related to EdTPA and sort of the horizon over the next year or so. But again, we're trying to recognizing that these things are on your agenda or kind of on your radar and ours. We've tried to prioritize and triage those immediate decisions. And then finally, there were several questions related to the 5-year continuing review of EPPs. And so I didn't know, Mark, Tam, I didn't know if y'all wanted to speak to this at all.
Yeah, I'll say something, and then I don't know if Tam, if you got anything to add. So right now, our plan is that programs that were on the schedule to have a 5-year review in starting in September, kind of on the 2020-2021 reporting year, we're planning on still having those reviews. Also, we know that there were a couple of folks who had on-site reviews scheduled for the end of this year, the end of this reporting year, the end of 1920. And we're in communication with y'all, and if we haven't been, we will be, about kind of options related to that. I think for those two programs, we'll plan on doing that kind of on an individualized basis as far as that on-site review. With regards to kind of the larger question about materials and preparation and all that sort of thing, our Ed Prep program team, the team that does these reviews kind of every summer, takes a look at the rubrics, the processes, and tunes up, engages with identifying opportunities for improvement, and then following any sort of edits or updates that are made to those processes. We hold a webinar in the summer for all the programs that are on the schedule to be reviewed in 2020-2021. And so at that point, it's a time for us to talk about all those pieces, provide clarity and transparency around any updates. One thing that I do know that I think we've nodded at a couple of times here related to science teaching reading is that programs that do file an attestation letter following the time period on that attestation letter, I do anticipate that we would be, part of this process is a review of some curriculum, of some certification areas, and I think that we would be interested in seeing, the evidence of the application of the STR standards into the curriculum within, that I think that'll help guide some of the restructuring that we do this summer. So that's kind of where we're at with it. Tam, do you have anything you'd like to add about that process?
No, Mark, you did a great job on that. You'll have the status report. The programs that are on rotation cycle for 2021 will have the status report sent to them ahead of time for the August continual approval review webinar. It's kind of like a training. This summer we'll update the status report. And then that will be, that basically is what we'll review at that webinar. So everybody will be comfortable, they'll be well informed. And then Matthew, I know you were talking about the time period. What would programs be required to be able to identify things quickly? 2 weeks, the way we've been operating the last 2 years, 2 weeks before the identified start date for the desk review, we send the list out for candidates. And then if we're on site, which was 9 this year, if you're on site, then you would get it the first morning that we arrive on site. So there's plenty of advanced information, and the training that will come out in August will highlight everything well in advance.
Cam, can I ask you a clarification about that?
Please.
Okay, so what you said about that 2-week window is what I was referring to. We just finished our application for the EC3. By the time we were done with it, with all the assessments, all the course guides, all the curriculum that we didn't have to turn in last time, that application was 657 pages long. If we have to do that kind of thing for the EC6 program, all 4 through 8 programs, the secondary programs, we can't do that in a 2-week window. If we know now exactly what it is that TEA wants to be able to see in terms of the review process in regard to the curriculum, we're going to be able to do a whole lot better job of being able to provide you what it is that you need to see. But I need to know what that is. So when you talk about the training with that, is that what you mean? And when will that training be provided in relation to when our visit comes?
Okay, let me answer it. That's a good question. We'll work through the summer to get all the forms updated and roll in the curriculum pieces, House Bill 18 on mental health, substance abuse, youth suicide, and then all the STR components that we'll be looking for evidence of in the curriculum in those different new certification areas. We'll do that in August, roll out all that information and the new status report and scoring rubric. The reviews actually won't start until sometime in October, because we've got state reporting where our team works with you seamlessly, working on state reporting, getting that ready for September 15th. And then when we go into the first review of state reporting, we're there as well with you. So we're blocking off basically the last part of August and September and the beginning of October for state reporting. So I anticipate if we follow the same schedule we did this year, we won't start reviews until probably middle to the end of October.
And Tam, can you clarify with me the piece where there's a 2 weeks? That's about pulling for candidate information, right?
Yes.
Want to see? Yeah. Okay. So
yeah,
that's because for ed prep programs, part of this is that we do review of candidate records, and that's the notification period for that.
Yeah, right. Mark, I have no problem. Tam, you too. I don't have a problem with that part. I understand that 2-week window on the candidates. It's just that the last time we did that, we didn't have to turn in the curriculum, and I know we will next time. It's the curriculum pieces, similar to what we just turned into for the STR application. That's what I need to know, would prefer to know now. So I've got time for all of the programs that we have, because we have 13 programs, to be able to get that in the format that you need. So it's always ready.
Normally the way that we do that, Matthew, is we'll go in and look for those particular pieces of curriculum that have been added since the legislature has added since the previous review. That's why we spend that time in the summer to update and roll in anything that's been added, in this case, as a result of House Bill 3. And then when we actually start looking at that, we'll be able to see evidence of that. Things like curriculum matrices. There's not anything that you'll have to create new. It's just reviewing current information. Remember, when you provide the letter of attestation, that basically says we will have that ready to go January of 2021. So the time now you're spending on getting all that curriculum modified and updated to incorporate those new pieces, that's what we'll be coming in and looking for in particular when the reviews start 10 or 11 months later in October.
And Tim, I just add, we have some flexibility as far as like the format that we would take curriculum and documentation around.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be put into the same format that was necessary for an application. Is that right?
And the status report that'll be ready toward the end of August, that will have all of that spelled out, the evidence pieces in the scoring rubric, the evidence. You can look right now and see what we used previously.
Okay, that's fine, Tam.
And it's on, Matthew, it's on the program provider resources page
Okay.
toward the bottom, the very bottom of that document.
Okay, that'll work. We'll go with that. Thank you.
There were several other questions that came in. The first was from Donna from Texas Tech around the 30-day wait between testing opportunities. So the State Board of Education approved that on Friday. So that will go into effect here shortly, and hopefully we'll be able to actually have more testing centers open to allow for that. But that did go through the process and did make it through the final part of that journey with the State Board of Education meeting on Friday of last week. I think we've talked about the accountability provisions for 19 and 20 on how that goes in. Dr. Galvan, would you like to talk a little bit more about your question as it relates to an intern being diagnosed with COVID-19?
Thank you. When you asked us to pose some questions for our meeting today, I reflected because our students that were scheduled to test for March and April were contacted by Pearson and rescheduled for May. So my understanding, because they've not posted anything, and based on what the governor has said about the state of Texas and COVID and trying to open up, I have confidence that the test centers will open up in May. I spoke to, we had a Zoom with our people scheduled to test, and they have not been notified and changed from their May date, which is good news. My concern is, okay, we get them ready. We've been getting them ready. We're doing online to touch up and see what they're studying. Those people can register for June and July. We can contact HR directors. They will be very understanding, I'm sure, and wait. My concern was, is there really a time where we do need a waiver? And that's going to be if the person is ill. They can contaminate once they open up the test centers, because there's this sense of urgency of, I want to keep my job, so I'm running a mild fever. I'm just not going to say anything. And then now we've created a really, really massive problem of people getting contaminated. So is it possible that we have an emergency waiver ready to go, that if the individual is ill or believes to be ill or has flu-like symptoms or has been diagnosed with COVID and is quarantined, that indeed this individual does need to have a temporary waiver? The challenge would be, what would be the equitable way of saying, well, I'm really not ready, I'll just say I'm sick, versus I really am ill? Would it require documentation to TEA, to the program, to both? What would be appropriate documentation so that we do protect the individuals who will be testing, hopefully in May, June, July, and August?
Dr. Galvan, thank you for raising that. I think once we have final guidance on it, it will address this issue. That is my hope. As you note, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of different situations here, and that's we've been trying to work through that and be mindful of sort of first and foremost the health and safety issues, just like you've raised. And so I believe once that final guidance comes out, that will provide more clarity on that. So it's one I'd like to be able to provide a definitive answer on today, but I can't. But I'm very optimistic we'll have answers soon that will address that. And then Dr. Queen, you had a question here about candidates being ready for fall 2020. And I think, as I noted earlier, this is our next round of, our next highest priority after we are able to address the questions for the current candidates, the candidates who are finishing, the candidates like Dr. Govan was just referencing. So we're gonna, that should be in the next tranche of guidance, or pretty close to it after that. So we sort of recognize that as the next highest priority.
Hey, Ryan, this is Zach. Can I ask a question about that?
Sure thing.
So with the May 1 agenda, in item 5, is that where staff is going to address some of these issues with the board?
I think our plan there on item 5 is to provide the board with a full update on everything that has taken place and sort of what has fallen within their authority. Like, for example, the 229, both with an authority and timeline to participate versus those that have required governor's waiver or those that the board's rules already provided for. So I think this one is one we will know more once we see what happens in the next few weeks as far as opening up the state, and that will inform what is possible and what needs to be done for this group of candidates.
So if we've got, if there are waivers that are required, whether it's to extend the intern certificate or to waive testing for a certificate, if it's through the waiver process, does it have to follow board rule where it's discussed, proposed, adopted, or is there an expeditious way for those rules to come into effect?
So one of the challenges is that there is no expeditious way to make new rules. So waivers can take place more quickly, as we did on the clinical teaching and on the practicum issue, where board requirements are waived by the governor. But as far as boards making new rules, there is an allowance for emergency rulemaking, but it doesn't do any good for SBEC, given that their rules are still subject to the State Board of Education. So there's really no way to effectuate those statutory provisions around emergency rulemaking. So given something like Chapter 229 and the accountability system provisions, there is time to address that well before the ratings would have been scheduled to come out. There would have been scheduled to be impacted. But there's this whole other set of sort of immediate issues that option doesn't work for. So we will know a little more about the incoming classes and sort of their impact as it relates to testing and certification as we get sort of this first round issued, and we'll have a little more time to see what the sort of state of the state is at that time.
Right, and I don't want to belabor this point. I guess I'm just trying to, is there a timeline, or are we waiting for the May 1 board meeting? I just know we're being inundated with questions from our candidates and students, and really, the only communication we've gotten was at, I believe, March 26th, which I'm appreciative of. But districts are asking us questions, what's this going to look like? And so I know we're trying to kick the can a little bit, but is there any timeline that you can provide?
Well, I'd say we are not kicking the can at all. I would say we will give an answer as soon as we have it. We will schedule something to report out to educator preparation programs. We will share out with districts as soon as we have an answer on that. And so I appreciate the urgency. We feel the urgency. Our team is in regular contact with districts too. Our team is in regular contact with candidates as well, and with programs. And so we share the sense of urgency, and rest assured, as soon as we have answers on that, we will share out.
And Ryan, I appreciate that. And probably kicking the can wasn't the right terminology. Maybe it was, prioritizing, and now we're starting to get down to the nitty gritty. So I apologize if the terminology wasn't correct. And I do appreciate the responsiveness that can be provided as we're just, districts are left wondering what does the end of this school year look like and ramping up for next school year as well.
Thank you all for your questions, your participation today, everything else. I think, these are incredibly difficult times, and the decisions y'all are being forced to make, and you're stuck in the middle much in the same way that we are stuck in the middle. And so we're going to get something out to you as soon as we have it. Dr. Queen has another question. Love to hear that. And then I'll kind of talk about upcoming dates of note.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. One of the questions that I have is, as we all know, in TAC, it requires candidates to have a principal recommendation for their standard certificate. And if a principal is not going to recommend a candidate, it says that the principal must provide documentation and the reason why, just to make sure that candidate knows why they're not being recommended. So if we have, and I saw this come up, another person asked the same question. We have principals who are saying, I don't feel like I can recommend this candidate because I did not observe them in the classroom. Or what if we have principals who are saying, I'm not going to share that documentation. It's my prerogative to say if I think they're ready or they're not, and I just think they're not ready. And principals are saying, well, you need a little bit more time in the classroom. So how do we move forward with our candidates in light of these waivers that are giving them the ability to finish their time, but yet we're at a stalemate with principals that are, because they didn't observe, they won't provide that recommendation. And one of the items that I might suggest is, as a program, if I go through the efforts to, I'm reaching out to principals and I'm saying, hey, Texas Administrative Code requires that the candidate and tell us why. Give us some documentation as to why this candidate is not being recommended, or make sure the candidate has that documentation. And if we reach out to a principal and a principal has no reply, can we recommend this candidate?
Dr. Queen, let me ask just for clarification, what would you normally do in this situation if COVID-19 were not happening, if we were not in this situation? What would you normally do?
Normally the conversation that I have with a campus principal is, hey, we had a conversation with you at midpoint. At the midpoint, our specific conversation with a campus principal is, how is this candidate doing? What does this candidate need to work on to make improvements to be able to be recommended? So we collect some documentation at their midpoint. And usually at midpoint, the principal says, oh, they're fine, everything is wonderful. The candidate has never been on a growth plan. And we have 5 observations on every single one of our candidates that have been on a certificate. No matter what kind of certificate, they still get 5 observations where we've left feedback with the principal, and the principal has not one time reached out to us with a concern. So tell us what has happened all of a sudden that this candidate is not worthy of being recommended, and how can we correct this moving forward? And usually when I have that conversation with a campus principal, they kind of go, well, you're right. I didn't do a very good job. I didn't work with them, and we're able to work that out. But in this situation where we're talking mid-March, candidates left the classroom and principals are saying they just need more time in the classroom. So I really feel that as a program, if I can look at my documentation and this candidate has never been on a growth plan by us or the district, our recommendations are that they're proficient in the classroom. I feel like we should have the ability to recommend a candidate for their standard certificate.
All right, I appreciate you raising that, talking through that. Let us capture that, go back and work through that, and see if we can put something in writing as far as a response to that that will address that for you. All right, as we look at dates here, we had originally intended our next EPAC meeting in July to be an in-person meeting, but I think that's unlikely at this point, given the state of the world and everything else, even if we are sort of moving towards being open back up. So most likely that will be in a webinar type format again in advance of the July SVEC meeting. Again, I really appreciate everyone's time here today, and we've got a couple more minutes if there's anything else anyone would like to address, and if not, we will be back in touch soon.
Ryan, this is Veronica. I have a question. When I was reading through the agenda, I've noticed that there's more like instructional coach and charter schools. Are there charter schools that will be applying for their own alternative program?
I
Or
don't actually know. Could you give me a little more specific about where your question's coming from? I don't actually know who's applying to be a program, and so I don't think anything is oriented that way. But if there's something specific you'd like us to look at, we can certainly do that.
I noticed there was a definition for instructional coach, but I should have written the page number because I read through the whole thing last night. But I'll email it in and I'll email the page number.
I think if it's the thing I'm thinking of, and there's a whole lot of moving parts in here, but if it's the thing I'm thinking of, there was a term used as an instructional coach or something like that within the context of the intensive pre-service item. And so it was used in those rules when they were put into place back in the fall, but there was no definition provided for it. So this was just going back to align that intensive pre-service provision. I think that's the one you're referencing there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would plus one that comment. That is what we're going on. The candidate coach was related to the intensive pre-service.
All right. Thank you all for your attendance and participation today. I think Mark and I are going to talk about how to reach back out and circle up on some things related to the weighting for 229, given its step of the process. We'll find some way to circle back up there. A lot of good feedback today around that and everything else. And just know that we continue to be here wherever here is for all of us, and just hope that you stay safe and stay well. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.